The Glasgow School of Art, built by Charles Rennie Mackintosh between 1897 and 1909. A school of art, a singular place to educate beauty, where you can learn to be an artist. The Glasgow School of Art, still open, has accepted students for over a century. Its singularity is that it was built by an architect trained in painting and design, Charles Rennie Mackintosh. When he won the competition to design the school, thanks to support from his friend the director, he was 30 years old. A major figure in current British Art Nouveau, he owed his reputation to his graphic designs that mixed organic and geometric motives and such diverse influences as symbolism and Japanism. A style that met with great success in Europe, although some named it nouille, or noodle art. Mackintosh is also known for the furniture that he designed for the bourgeois elite of the city, unique pieces conceived as works of art. At the end of the 19th century, Glasgow was prosperous and powerful. Its shipyards were the largest in the world. The city also possessed some of the worst slums in Europe. Lacking any university or artistic tradition, Glasgow wanted to change its image and to develop a cultural ambition to match its industrial power. But Glasgow society was still hesitant, and the funds collected for the new school project were meagre. A generous philanthropist donated a parcel of ground on which to build the school. But it was not really a gift. The terrain is on a very steep slope. Located on a mound in the heart of Glasgow, the only area of the parcel suitable for building was a rectangle 75 metres long and 30 wide, running along a minor road. Mackintosh had no choice but to put up a building whose main facade turned its back on the city. He also had to submit to very precise conditions established by the sponsors, who stipulated that all the artist studios must be north-facing, so as to avoid direct light, and specified their number, size, and also the shape and dimensions of the windows. The scrupulous response of the architect to the imposed programme was an austere main facade of inevitable constructive rationality, meant to indicate the end use of the building. But his detractors thought otherwise, finding it as monotonous and dull as the front of a factory. To combat this austerity, Mackintosh undertook to decorate the facade with elements in cast iron whose twists end in flower buds. An organic motif dear to Art Nouveau, but quite atypical in architecture. These flimsy brackets caused much comment. Some saw them as supports for window cleaners to rest their ladders on, others as elements to stiffen the large sheets of glass. They have no function at all. For the architect, only the intention to decorate counts. Modern ideas of modern clothes to give them the vibration of nature and fantasy of life. A poorly understood fantasy, qualified at the time as perverse mannerism, and which, much to the discontent of the sponsors, bit deeply into the budget. But Mackintosh was not satisfied with this stylized ornamentation. He literally broke into the middle of the facade by implanting a manner that seems to come from an earlier period. Into it he placed the entrance, the director's offices and apartments. In juxtaposing epoch and architectural vocabulary, he created a new approach. He amused himself with this incongruous collage by grafting totally incoherent elements onto this truncated manor house. A tower rises without reason high above the staircase it contains. A disproportionate and above all perfectly pointless balcony. The view of the city is on the other side. And finally, an entrance that is subtly off-centre. Or nearly so. Because while the architect did not in fact place it in the middle of the block, yet it is exactly in the centre of the facade. At first sight, an undetectable asymmetry, like the windows. 3 on the left, 4 on the right. With his obsession for detail and his taste for discordance, Mackintosh managed to take astonishing liberties with the rigorous initial brief. The choice of associating constructive functionality and Art Nouveau subjectivism was to guide his work all the way through the building period that was in 2 phases spread over several years, without Mackintosh ever setting foot on site. Inside, the specifications imposed on the architect an equally draconian organisation of space. The height and width of the corridors between studios was detailed to the inch, even to the number of plaster casts on show to stimulate the creativity of the students. Mackintosh obeyed orders conscientiously at first and summarily installed sawn planks painted black to protect the walls from passing students and works. On the other hand, he took care to safeguard the entrance to the studios with unexpected delicacy. The glazed doors are all decorated with rosebuds, which are a reminder of the fresh flowers delivered to the entrance of the studios at the express wish of the architect. An elegant injunction to the artist to seek inspiration in nature. In creating this threshold effect, the architect was staging a symbolical path that led from the dark and compressed world into the white, luminous and expansive volumes of the studios. Mackintosh decided to interfere as little as possible in these spaces. Their layout, dimensions and the movable partitions arranging them were all mentioned in the specifications. The architect could have introduced decorative elements, but he chose to leave these volumes as virgin territory, as though he stood back, to leave the field free for the students' creativity. All conceived on an identical pattern, the studios are large empty cubes with a northern exposure. The school caters, of course, for painters who need light above all, but also for sculptors and craftsmen who handle heavy materials and whose work is noisy. So the layout is on 3 distinct levels. The largest studios, those with the most light on the first floor, are devoted to teaching the so-called noble arts, drawing and painting. Those on the ground floor, half as high, are dedicated to architecture and live models. Finally, tucked into the basement are woodwork, ornaments and metalwork. a revelation of the social hierarchy of artistic practice in a given period. This distribution no longer makes any sense. Today, the arts mix freely in volumes that have not changed structurally in any way. A century after the creation of the school, Mackintosh's architectural offer has withstood cultural upheavals. More numerous nowadays, the students need to prove a little more imagination to privatize their work areas. The general structure of the building is extremely simple. The architect placed the corridors serving all the studios at the rear of the building. Then he added 2 external wings and a central block. A remarkably simple affair whose plan is E-shaped. The central block houses the main staircase that serves all floors. The treatment of the narrow and sombre stairwell is surprising. The architect set up a forest of poles and imposing balustrades, assembled so as to emphasize the verticality. A very elaborate design inspired by traditional Japanese houses. But contrary to what Mackintosh was pleased to let us believe, none of these so carefully staged poles is load-bearing. The apparent complexity of the staircase is merely an illusion. The stairs and the well are in fact made in concrete, so they are self-standing. The architect could then himself give free rein to his imagination to decorate his stairs with exposed elements in wood that have no constructive utility. To crown his astonishing illusion, the architect, with a certain irony, raised 4 corner posts, more than 9 metres high, that support nothing at all. This embellishment, both complex and sophisticated, with its visual impact, enabled Mackintosh to turn an ordinary staircase into a spectacular event. It opens onto a large landing where the students can exhibit their work together. So Mackintosh's intervention is minimal. As in the studios, the decorator stands back, leaving the artist free to take the place over. The solid framework of this hall gives it a barn-like look. Once again, there is a dramatic change of environment. With his sense of detail and scale, Mackintosh amused himself by piercing delicate hearts. For whom? And above all, why at this height? No one has ever found the answer. While the areas devoted to the students are given a minimal decorative treatment, in the director's office, Mackintosh designed all the elements of decoration, and with obsessive attention to the plan, chose the position of every lamp and each item of furniture. On the floor above, there is the director's personal studio. The means of access that Mackintosh designed was a staircase so narrow that large works could not negotiate it. Refusing to widen the stairs, the architect preferred to open a discreet trap in the ceiling. The layout of the school follows a perfectly functional scheme. Once the studio block was settled, traffic flow and exhibition hall established, it only remained to accommodate, in the 2 wings at right angles, a library at one end and all the administrative offices at the other. Considered secondary by the sponsors, no special demands were made for the treatment of the side facades. Freed from all programmatic constraints, Mackintosh radically changed the style. For the office block, he built an imposing stone cliff reminiscent of a Scottish medieval castle. Continuing the idea of this facade, he turned with a little fantasy to the architectural vocabulary of defence and mischievously mixed shapes whose relief, design and size make up a particularly eclectic whole. This astonishing composition reads like a sketchbook and is in stark contrast to the industrial image reflected by the main facade. Moreover, half the wall is left blind, an odd dissymmetry that the architect took pleasure in underlining by putting a drain pipe in the middle of the wall, and in topping the rampart with a dovecote never supplied with grain. At more than 30 metres from the ground, it is inaccessible. This amazing partition of the facade is not just an architectural effect. While the architect dreamed up the imposing bare wall like a blank page turned to refresh the eye before discovering the principal facade, it also serves to hide the studios. Left blind, these corners reveal the depth of their volume. The other gable end, 10 years later, demonstrates a profound change in Mackintosh's work. Solidly spaced by a series of geometric windows, it presents a resolutely modern face. Projecting like bow windows, a line of 3 raised bays set more than 90 metres high break up the facade. In contrast to the other wing, this time the architect chose a drastically formal composition, where each vertical and each horizontal line complies with strict geometry. This time excluding any hint of variety in the detail. The vertiginous windows, worthy of a Gothic cathedral, give on to the library, considered today as one of the treasures of the art school. Mackintosh inclines here to the typical traditional large library, with a reading room and raised galleries to house the books. But he spectacularly transforms this typology by exaggerating the visual importance of the pillars of the gallery, which without reason heavily encroach on the space of the reading room. These pillars are of a singular design. A first shaft rises 6 metres. It is flanked by 2 more, supporting 2 beams, sandwiching the first shaft. This framework supports the gallery that Mackintosh set back to reveal the structure bearing it. Then he bordered it with an imposing balustrade, then added a false ceiling that closes the volume. The final effect is an illusion. The pillars appear to hold up the false ceiling, while in reality it is suspended by metal hooks from two concrete beams. Not content with encumbering the reading room, the architect deliberately sacrificed more than a quarter of the volume of the library, as if he was struggling here against an excess of space, with a certain sense of paradox. The library is certainly where Mackintosh devoted the major part of his time. Never having set foot in the place, according to the legend, he sent his plans, changed again and again, with the position of each piece of furniture and the designs for each decorative detail drawn on loose leaves or cigarette packets. In contrast with this overloaded and sombre volume, the Board of Directors' office is deliberately bright and uncluttered. This sobriety and discretion failed to convince the board members. They refused to sit in it, judging it to be too feminine. But apart from this gender conflict, another Mackintosh appeared whose new ways brought the building into the 20th century. In 1907, in the final building campaign, the architect had to design an extra story to house female students, now admitted to the school. He crowned his building with two large metal and glass boxes, determinedly modern. But he came up against a planning problem. Modernity does not always sit easily with the older styles. The roof of the central manor house stopped the young women going from one box to the other. To avoid sacrificing the design of the principal facade, he decided to graft on new means of access, which he hid at the rear of the building. A corridor connecting the two new studios, a second passage, and 3 additional staircases that he tucked into the angles. In these staircases, the concrete is for once left visible. It was even polished, then waxed, and finally decorated with the famous 9 squares, Mackintosh's new signature, as he had definitively abandoned the fin de siècle floral patterns. The first corridor at the rear of the building is entirely glazed and designed with the simplicity of a greenhouse. Reserved for women, their kindly masculine colleagues nicknamed it the hen house. Its transparency and lightness distinguish it from the second corridor, with which Mackintosh prolonged it. Once again, he alternates styles by creating here a huge space roofed like a medieval cellar. A final kind thought from the artist for the students, he installed fold-away work tables so that at last they could enjoy a view of the city. These loggias are the only projecting windows on the rear facade. In 1909, at the end of the site work, the purse was almost empty. The backers refused to let the architect have any decoration or projections on this last facade. By sinking the windows into the walls, he twisted the rules once again and designed the last of the school's faces so that it enters definitively into modern times. After having devoted years to this masterpiece, Mackintosh built nothing more. He ended his life in the south of France, painting flowers until he died. The Glasgow School of Art was despised and neglected for a very long time. It was not until the 50s that the strength of the building and Mackintosh's freedom of style were at last recognised.